Video game camera angles, they come in all different shapes and sizes. First person, third person, over the shoulder, side scroller, visual novels, top down, the list goes on. However, over the years in gaming, as many concepts and trends have come and gone through its ever advancing technology, it seems like one form of perspective seems to be lacking in the modern day, that being the fixed camera angle. You really started to see them around the original PlayStation era, and they were a genius way to show more complex scenery whilst also getting around the system's technical limitations to allow for more detail and atmosphere on screen instead of having to 3D model every single asset, which would have taken more development time. It very quickly became the de facto style to display horror games in, as well as other genres on the 5th and 6th generation of machines. And they just looked incredible. I could honestly just stop and stare at some of these vistas for hours. A lot of these still look great and have made these games age more gracefully in the modern day. Similar to something like a cel-shaded art style, fixed cameras in games can really help older titles age well and become almost timeless on a visual level in a sense. This is since for every single screen the developers intended you to look in that exact direction. Less control of the camera allowed for more detailed and picturesque environments. There's no free camera system allowing you to make any unsavory angles that can look awkward and be pretty immersion breaking.
What the hell is this?
Sometimes less is more, and in this case less control of the camera allowed for more grand vistas to look at and peer into. And I mean, let's just be honest for a moment, there's always been issues with free cameras in games. Things are gonna get maybe a little controversial here, but still, to this day, despite its beginnings with Ocarina of Time, locking on in most action games can be an absolute pain to handle despite its integration being nearly 30 years old since the N64. It can still feel extremely sluggish to use in a game and just looks like a mess. A fixed camera simply eliminates all issues that come with controlling a camera in the first place. In some ways they can be great for newcomers of gaming since they don't have to worry about moving the camera and character at the same time. Sure, they can't be utilised in more fast-paced games, or maybe they can in some cases like with the original God of War games and the first Devil May Cry entry, but things quickly changed during the 7th generation of systems with the jump to high definition graphics and the increase of production costs that came with it, as well as games becoming more cinematic with their cutscenes. It all led to the fixed camera perspective becoming a thing of the past. But these jaw-dropping and beautiful games made possible through the use of a fixed camera are still worth celebrating even today, despite what modern game development might think. These larger-than-life perspectives that look like a literal canvas being brought to life aren't as easy to create as just merely adding a fixed perspective to your game and calling it a day. A fixed camera perspective is way more than just an angle, there's actual cinematography that comes with it. Levels and areas have to be designed around the perspective rather than just having a 3D environment to explore with a fixed angle. Every screen has to make sense and meticulously fit together to sell the player on what's being presented to them. Props and items are also carefully set in place not only to signal to the player to interact with them, but to also sell you on these breathing canvases that are supposed to look lived in. A lot of these games also feature zero UI on screen to feel more immersive, which is another reason they rely heavily on environments that have strong visual identities. The term cinematic has become hated on when it comes to fans of games due to how it can take control away from the player and feel a bit too limiting and linear, like you're just playing a movie. But I find that fixed cameras feel more cinematic than games that rely too much on cutscenes. They really are the perfect blend of still having the video game part of your game, such as actually interacting with it, but it also feels like the director is always there with these cuts between screens and frames that tell a story. It's not just taking control away from the player and making them watch a movie, but actually blending film and gaming together in a way that makes sense and complements this medium opposed to it feeling the other way around. There are many amazing examples out there of games that use fixed camera angles really well, but before taking a deeper dive into this topic, we first need to establish just what a fixed camera actually is. There has been a lot of discussions on what actually constitutes as a fixed camera perspective when researching this topic online. This is since, even in games where they are included when listing examples, they will also have moments where the camera follows the player, and of course cutscenes might also break this convention of a static shot. For me personally, what I will clearly define as a fixed camera angle is any instance in a 3-dimensional game in particular during gameplay where the player has no control over the camera. When looking into online definitions for the term fixed camera angles, many sites and articles mention the inclusion of a static camera, but I feel like this greatly limits what is and isn't a fixed perspective. Take the PlayStation 2's library for instance, that are mentioned to have this camera convention. Sure, the camera is moving here in this example and is not in place, but it's still fixed in the sense that you can't move it and it's been directed to move in a very specific railroaded way. I'm sorry, but to completely ignore every PlayStation 2 title that uses fixed cameras because on the odd occasion they'll move the perspective, which is still on rails and fixed in the sense that it's not being controlled by the player, is a bit ridiculous, which is why I'll be counting them as examples in this video. Also, for the sake of further distinction on what is and what isn't a fixed camera, I'm referring to games where you can't control the camera angle, where there is no camera movement when moving the right analog stick for instance. Some fixed camera games still move the camera, which you could argue breaks the effect. However, they still manage to pull off that same impact and in some ways do it even better since the camera will shift between different focus points, allowing for more seamless transitions between fixed perspectives. For the sake of brevity and to make a more easier to understand distinction, fixed cameras are always in third person and feature no control of the camera with limited to no movement of said camera. On the other side of the spectrum, you have every other 3D game which features a dynamic camera which can be moved around using the second analog stick, a mouse, Z-targeting or even a damn Wii remote infrared visor. Anyway, with that lengthy definition out of the way, let's take a look at what made these uses of having a fixed camera so interesting to begin with by looking at some actual games that implemented them in a way that heightens their themes, presentation and tone in a way that feels impactful. Why not first begin with one of the earliest and most well-known examples of using a fixed camera in a successful way, and the reason the style was so popular back in the day for a reason, that being the first Resident Evil game. Or more specifically, with the 2002 remake on the GameCube that still looks incredible all these years later. This title is the reason this style of cinematography became so synonymous with the horror genre in the first place. And you never truly feel alone with how they're implemented here. It's as if someone, or more likely something, is constantly watching your every step with how the camera cuts between different shots. Every snap of the camera was filled with so much personality and life. When accompanied with these incredible looking pre-rendered backgrounds, every screen pretty much had its own story to tell that you got a glimpse into whilst exploring the Spencer mansion. It might look awkward at first to an outsider who's never played a game that looks like this before, but the tank controls and more slower pace of the game flows seamless with this more avant-garde presentation, and it's still worth playing all these years later because of it. To further prove my point here, they had a choice when remaking this game to remove the fixed camera now that they were on more stronger hardware, but they kept it in since they knew how integral it was to the original game's experience and atmosphere. Capcom and Squaresoft are the most well-known examples of developers adopting the use of the fixed camera back in the late 90s and early 2000s. The most iconic examples of series that had these camera angles were Final Fantasy 7 through 10 and the previously mentioned early Resident Evil games. I've already gone through the PlayStation 1 Final Fantasy games but only recently gotten around to 10, and I've got to say, like the Resident Evil 1 remake, it's one of the best examples of just how well this camera can be done. The land of Spira is supposed to be this massive place that takes you on a journey as you soak up every locale along the way as a guardian to the summoner. The camera still cuts between shots like in Resident Evil and the previous Final Fantasy games that were in 3D. But 10 likes to take it a step further by having the camera occasionally pan showing off your destination in the distance with its amazing looking skyboxes. But you will occasionally still come across the lone static shots like when you're in an indoors area such as the shops and inns. Also, it can't just be me here, but there's something so warm and welcoming about how these shots are depicted that just makes me want to live inside of them. The way everything's positioned here just comes across as very inviting, which I guess is the whole point of an inn since you're supposed to want to stay there. It's really hard to put into words, but they just look right and very nostalgic even to people who haven't grown up with them. I've heard similar comments be made about this before. And I mean, I don't know, they just put my mind at ease looking at them, they're very comforting. Hopefully other people can get where I'm coming from here. Also, the word cozy is banned from this channel. Too many outlets and posts use the word to where it's lost all meaning, so yeah, I'm not going to use that word to describe anything in this video. But you can argue that the word does fit here, but I refuse to say it. Anyway, moving on, there are also some other titles that use this perspective to great effect, for instance with Haunting Grounds. And how in some ways it one also fits perspectives found in the earlier Resident Evil titles by zooming out the focus a bit more, allowing you to better see each stalker that chases you as well as noticing the different hiding spaces that are littered throughout exploring. It's also implemented in a way that complements some of the themes of Haunting Grounds and how you're constantly being watched and stalked, which further adds to the atmosphere of feeling vulnerable and defenseless. Which is kinda the whole point, since this is one of the few horror games out there where you don't have any weapons and must rely on quick thinking to navigate around stalkers. There's also other examples of great uses of the fixed camera found outside of the horror genre, like with the Xenosaga games. Once again on the PlayStation 2, they had these isolated environments and never-ending skyboxes that can often feel liminal at times. Xenosaga was a very cinematic series, and it pushed hard at the time to have every moment feel that way, be it in its cutscenes or gameplay. I'm also a fan of how quiet these moments are, with how no actual music is playing, just the sounds of footsteps and the environment, so I'm not really sure what vibe it was going for here, unlike with horror. But if I'd have to guess, then with it being centered around space travel, maybe they wanted to express the more empty, isolated and alone feeling you get with the context, whilst also showing the beauty that comes along with that same ambience. Also, I'm kinda just embracing the whole pretentious tone that comes from making these style of videos. I don't usually go for this kind of thing, just throwing it out there for anyone who's watching this channel for the first time. Moving back on topic, when researching for this video, I did come across many different games that technically use a fixed camera that you wouldn't think did so at first. There's the Crash Bandicoot trilogy that uses it to a more nefarious and infamous effect, where moving backwards or towards the camera made for some extremely scary jumps since you'd have barely enough time to react to where you was about to land. It could also make for some head scratching moments when judging the game's depth perception when trying to make a jump. Mario 3D World would also use this same fixed camera system to better house its co-op focused gameplay since everyone had to share the same screen. Speaking of, the Paper Mario series still uses the same fixed camera it's had since its days back on the N64. And it kinda has to, since the whole illusion of having these 2D characters on a 3D plane would easily fall apart with the inclusion of a 3D dynamic camera. But for me, these examples don't really give off that same impact and aura like how Final Fantasy or Resident Evil did it. They instead feel more in line with the genre and less of a stylistic choice. But there is still a great example of a game that did continue the art of the fixed camera during the 7th generation of consoles and with a jump to HD with the JRPG Resonance of Fate. Whilst not having full-on fixed camera angles outside of battles, when exploring the world of Basil, these beautiful fixed angles are implemented to give you an idea of what this steampunk-themed world is like from the citizen's perspective. The exposed cogs and machinery that make up this bizarre city is made all the more striking with how it's depicted using a fixed camera. It intentionally goes for that pre-rendered aesthetic found in older titles, but with the modern look of a game in HD by having everything be modelled in 3D. This game is a nice blend of Japan's take on the West, and it's made all the more striking with its use of cinematography, using a fixed perspective to depict its world. And it stands out more today since it's one of the few games of the HD generation of consoles to maintain this stylistic choice of presentation. There are still tons of examples of fixed cameras being used in games out there. Even the original Animal Crossing had them, and you could argue to some degree that the modern entries don't maintain its fixed camera roots with how it doesn't move independently outside of tracking the player. These camera angles are great, and in all honesty, I just wanted to make this video to talk about them. They are one of the many small details that go into making a game that gets overlooked by most players. And despite this video's focus on more older games, fixed cameras in the modern day aren't completely dead. There are still indie titles releasing that purposefully implement them as a way of feeling nostalgic, which is a cool effect. You'll also see them pop up from time to time in more mainstream releases. Metaphor ReFantasio for instance still has them whenever the party discovers the landmark, which is a clever way to not have to fully model these massive environments. They still sell you on the look of these larger than life environments and are a good implementation of the perspective, which kinda brings things full circle since they were birthed as a means around not having to 3D model everything. But still, personally, I'd love to see the next Resident Evil or Final Fantasy title bring back its roots using fixed cameras. Similar to turn-based games and how they were also birthed from technical limitations, there's still an audience for them, and I mean you still often see them brought up online from time to time. And I mean, I can't just accept their existence as just being some outdated design used in early 3D games. Sure, they came from the same era, but they can still have a place in modern gaming without taking anything away. And if you ask me, I still think they absolutely have a place in modern titles. But with all that being said, now I'm curious, do you think fixed cameras still have a place in modern gaming? Feel free to let me know in the comments. Also, any feedback on this video will be appreciated. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day.